Hey everyone, and welcome to our live event. I'm your host, Ian Plant. I am here with co-host Joe Rossbach, and for some reason,
Hello.
my video is not showing up. Joe,
I
can you
see.
see? You can see it on your end.
I see you just
You
fine.
see me? Okay, it's just not showing up on my end for some reason, but
Yeah.
that's okay. So everyone, come on in. We're going to wait for all the attendees to pile in here, and let's see.
Hey, Linda from Albany.
Yes,
Linda's
there
in
we
the
go.
chat.
We're getting people
Oh,
coming in.
yep.
Got 100 people so far. We got almost 500 people registered. So I think people are going to be coming in. So come on in, say hello, tell us where you are from, and check out our poll that we have, just asking you what your favorite kind of photography is. If your favorite kind of photography is not listed, I do apologize. And we're going to get started in just a few moments.
Well, here we go. Hello, hey, everybody. They're coming in so fast now. I'm just going to say hi,
Yeah.
hi, hi. And it
Let's
looks
see.
like so far, everybody's favorite genre of photography is landscape, according to the poll.
Well, that's not a surprise. We did
That's
say
not a
we would
surprise
be talking
considering
about
who they
landscape
came to
photography
see.
today.
That jumped up pretty quickly.
Yeah, wow. So many people coming in from Canada. Hello, Kathy from Alberta. Thank you for joining us. And let's see. Wow, lots of places from the US. Oh, yeah.
Nice.
We're going to definitely shout out the folks coming from different countries. Let's see. Lots of folks from the US and Canada. Mike from St. Paul, almost 50 degrees here in the Twin Cities. Yes, it is. It's a beautiful day. I can't wait for this little event to be over, and then I'm going to go outside and take a walk and enjoy the nice spring weather.
Yeah, it's really warm here today. I'm loving it. I'm leaving tomorrow for Charleston, so it's going to be pretty warm down there too. I'm pretty happy about that. Syracuse,
All right.
Quebec, Stand.
All right. So everyone, you should feel free to say hi in the chat. Reserve the Q&A portion of the chat for questions you would like to ask Joe and I. And Joe and I are going to start off by presenting some of our favorite recent photos. Now, Joe, you were out in the American West.
That's correct. Last month I was in a 3-week trip. Spent a week in southern Utah, and then I was in Death Valley and the Eastern Sierra in California for 2 weeks last month. Yeah,
that's fantastic. And I just got back from several weeks along the south shore of Lake Superior, photographing the ice formations that form along the cliffs and caves that are found in that area. So probably much different weather than what you had.
Probably much colder.
Yeah, it
was an interesting trip. It was clear, like 90% of it. So.
Oh, well, that is pretty typical for this time of year in the American West.
Yeah.
It was cloudy 90% of the time up on Lake Superior, and it was very cold. It's been a very cold winter, and all of a sudden, at least here in the Twin Cities, winter is over and it's spring now.
Yep. We had a blast of snow on Saturday, 4 inches and 50-mile-an-hour winds. It was miserable, and then the next day it was 61 degrees. So the weather is all over the map.
All right. Well, why don't we get started with some image review? So Joe and I have put together some of our recent photos, and we're going to just walk through how we approached making those photos and what techniques we were using. So hopefully these techniques will be techniques that you can also use with your own photography. So I'm going to just go on over and start that presentation. And the first image is by Joe. Joe, tell us a little bit about this image. Where was it taken and how did you take it?
This is a shot from the Owens Valley in California. So that's the Owens Valley sits in between the Sierra Mountains and Death Valley National Park. It runs north-south. It's essentially a desert valley. It's very dry, rather uninteresting in most places in the valley. But there are, obviously you have these incredible views of the mountains. This is a shot of willow and rabbit brush and cottonwoods and sage. So whenever creeks run out of the mountains into the valley, there's, these really great scenes where you can photograph these wonderful trees. And they look awesome in the winter because they take on these really cool pastel tones with their, the lack of leaves on the trees. Very, very graphic situation. Telephoto shot. Just looking to stack multiple layers of texture and color in the image. And so that's that shot.
Okay, well, it may be a little hard to see in the video, but when I look closely at this image, it seems to me like there's a little bit of softness to it.
Mhm.
And I wasn't sure if you did some sort of multiple exposure blend to do something here to create sort of this soft painterly look, or whether you did maybe like a negative clarity adjustment when you were processing the image file.
Yeah, it does have that look to it, and I did do that in camera in the field, and that's a technique that I use not a lot, but occasionally if I feel like the detail in a certain image is going to be a little too overwhelming, and this image obviously would have just a ridiculous amount of detail between all of the plant life in it. So I took a traditional exposure. I set my camera to do multiple exposures. I can do that with my Nikon camera system. I can take multiple exposures in camera, and it will give me a raw file actually, which is really nice because then I can treat it like I normally would when I get back to Lightroom to start developing it. But anyway, I did one traditionally shot at f/16 sharp focus all the way through, and then I opened up my aperture to f4, which is the widest I can get on that lens, and I defocused the image just a little bit. And when they went together, it kind of gives it that sort of classical soft focus look to it.
Yeah, I think that really looks great.
Thank you.
Let's move on to the next photo. This is one of mine from one of the ice caves on the south shore of Lake Superior. And you get into these caves. So in the summer, this is a sandstone cave, and the floor of the cave is flooded. So you can't actually stand in the cave in the summer. There's probably several feet of water. So, I mean, I've kayaked along these cliffs, and a lot of these places that you can just walk in the winter when the lake levels are lower and there's a lot of lake ice are in deep water in the summer. But there are all these intricate ice formations that were on the ceiling of this cave. And so I went very wide, used a wide angle lens to capture not only all of the beautiful textured ice inside the cave on the ceiling, but also to get some of the formations at the bottom of the cave, these ice crystals that were forming. And I got really close with my wide angle lens to exaggerate the size of that foreground feature to make it much more prominent in the composition, and to establish a near far relationship between what was in front of me and what was in the background. I was looking out the cave opening, so that is actually the shoreline of Lake Superior that you can kind of barely see, the frozen shoreline of Lake Superior that you can barely see out through the cave entrance. And it's really a fantastic place. I mean, these ice formations are intricate, and this is the kind of place where you just want to get into these formations. You want to crawl and slither through like a snake into some of these small little passages and use a wide angle lens to really open up that space and make the shot more compelling.
Hey, I have a question.
Yeah.
How small of a cave is this? Like, can you stand up in this? It's hard to tell, you know?
Yeah, so this cave you could actually stand up. I think the top of the cave, depending on where you were, was as high as maybe 15 or 20 feet above you. And then as you go deeper into the cave, it gets progressively smaller and smaller. And so when I was in the back of the cave, and the cave was probably about 40 or 50 feet deep. And when I was in the back of the cave making the shot, I was sitting on the ground because it had narrowed to the point where I couldn't stand up anymore.
It's pretty wild, man.
Okay, we'll move on to the next photo. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A portion of the chat. And if you go into the chat, you'll see that there's two different tabs you can choose. So choose Q&A only if you have any questions for us about these images. So Joe, this is one of yours, and I absolutely love this photo. Tell us about it.
This is from the Mesquite Sand Dunes in Death Valley, in California. Like I said, I was out there for a couple of weeks. I had 2 back-to-back workshops, and then I had some breaks before and in between each of those. And this is actually taken middle of the day, around 2:00 in the afternoon, when typically we have really bad light for landscape photography. But I will often go out and do a lot of shooting these days in black and white during the middle of the day, because black and white translates really well at times of the day when maybe color landscape work doesn't translate as well, because the color palette is rather harsh. And you can use this sort of really contrasty, harsh light to make some incredibly abstract images. This is with a very long lens. So this was with my Nikon 200 to 500. And this is right around about, I believe, between 400 and 500 millimeters, somewhere in there, to stack up all those layers of light and shadow in the image. And then in post, for my workflow, I do very little global adjustments to my images, and I do mostly targeted adjustments. So I kind of especially, we'll just talk about for black and white for a moment. After the initial conversion, I'll try to set the tonality overall through the shot. And then through a series of moves with dodging and burning, I sort of kind of shape the light and balance the light throughout the image. I decided to really burn down the top of this image quite a bit to keep the eyes sort of coming back in and moving through the repetition of the light and shadow throughout the dunes.
Yeah, I think this is spectacular. Joe, can you guess what it is specifically that I love about this image?
No.
All right, so
a guess, but I'm not
okay,
sure.
Why don't you give it a guess really quick?
The abstract nature of it, I don't know.
Well, I mean, I do love that. Okay, so what I love about this is you've got this curve at the very bottom of the image frame, that shadow, and it's got this nice curving shape, and it's kind of curving from the lower left, kind of working its way to the right edge of the image frame. And then in the background, there's this other dune, the last dune, that kind of curves from the right edge to the upper left. And so these two curves are the mirror image of each other. And they're both just sort of curving around, and they frame the scene, and they just get the eye kind of rolling around in this radial pattern. It's just a spiral that just sucks the eye in. I think it's brilliant. And I think it looks fantastic.
I can't honestly say that I had any of those thoughts when I was composing the image. However, I do think that when you do photography long enough, you tend to just begin to see things in the abstract if you really train your brain to do that. And so a lot of times when I'm out taking images or I'm out taking photographs, yeah, there are certain things that I'm obviously thinking about, but sometimes it's just like, it's in the back of my head and I don't even realize that I'm composing for it sometimes until I get back and start to look at it later on the computer. I don't know if you have that too going on with yourself sometimes, Ian.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, sometimes you just kind of have an intuitive sense when you're in the field. So You're not really thinking about it. You're in the moment, you're working. There are other times when I'm actually sitting there with my pondering face.
Of course, I've seen that face before.
Yes, you've seen it.
Yes.
Most of the time, I'm just faking it. I'm just pretending to be pondering. I want people to think that I look smart.
Yes, so humble.
So moving on to the next image, this is another ice cave shot. And one thing I love about these ice caves, these ice formations, typically, these aren't real ice caves like you might have in a glacier like that you'll find in places like Iceland. These are these ice formations that form as water seeps through the sandstone. So you've got these overhanging cliffs and you've got these small sandstone caves along the south shore of Lake Superior. And water is typically seeping through the sandstone there. It's very porous. And in the winter, that water seeping down forms these icicles that just kind of get bigger and bigger, and they just drape over the edges of these cliffs and caves. And they often get, long enough that they touch the ground. So it's kind of like a cave with stalactites and stalagmites. And what I love about these ice formations is when the light is behind them, when they're backlit by the sun on a sunny day, you can just see all of the colors inside the cave. And some of the ice is stained yellow because there's tannin in the water that's seeping through the sandstone. But for the most part, it's white ice. So the color isn't really coming from anything native to the ice itself. It's just coming from the thickness of the ice. At least I think this is how it works. I don't really understand the physics or the optics of it. But as the ice gets thicker, it starts blocking out certain color wavelengths. So eventually, if the ice is thick enough, it'll only let in blue. That's the only wavelength that can penetrate the ice. And that's why when you're in a deep glacier, for example, the ice is very blue because that ice is so thick and only the blue wavelength will go through it. But if you were to slice off a little portion of that ice, you could tell that it was clear. And so when you're in these caves and they're backlit, you can get these great colors. Usually you get a mix of greens. Some of the ice is thick enough so that it actually goes blue. And it's just really fantastic. And so for this shot, once again, I was working with a super wide angle lens, working with a 9mm lens on a full frame camera. And often I'm fairly close to the ice formations. So, the distance between my camera and the foreground might be only a few feet or even a few inches. So a lot of times when I'm making these shots, I've got a focus stick and I'll use a small aperture like f11 to give me a little bit of depth of field. And then I'll just change my focus point going from near to far so that I've got a bunch of images that represent all of the focus points in the scene. And then I blend them together later using a dedicated focus stacking program like Helicon Focus. And it's a really great way of just getting some extra sharpness from near to far in your photos.
Yeah, that's a cool shot. Hey, what I really like about it is the play of light or the play of color in the image between those really, really cool like greens and those blues towards the bottom. I think that is just really interesting. Is that green natural, like to the ice, or?
Well, as I said, I don't think the ice actually has the color. So what's happening is
the way the light's refracting through it at the top part of it.
Exactly. So the
That's
thickness,
wild.
So the thickness, actually probably what's going on is it's mostly blue light coming through, and there might be some tannin that stay in that ice. So it might actually be yellow ice. So yellow plus blue equals green.
There it is. Cool.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to the next photo, which is another one from Joe. And I'm going to let him tell everyone where this was from and how he shot it. But I just want to say I love the juxtaposition of foreground and background here. I think it's really cool that Joe incorporated that little bit of the sandstone formation down at the bottom, that sort of circle that just pushes the eye deeper into the scene. I think it looks fantastic.
Yep. So this is from southern Utah. This is out in a fairly remote region of desert situated between Moab and Capitol Reef National Parks. It's a BLM area. It's a wilderness area. What you're seeing in the background are the Henry Mountains, and then these really interesting sort of clay and bentonite hills and sandstone mixed in. This is where I spent my week in Utah, in this general region, kind of working this area. I was doing a lot of drone photography as well. This is obviously not a drone image. This is just with my regular camera. So like when I got up to the top of this mound, I was really drawn to all the circular shapes that I was seeing in the image, especially, I mean, obviously the most dominant one, when you get up to the top and you're just standing there looking out as an observer, is the one that's just in mid-ground off to the left. It's very dominant landform there, right? And so I knew that I was going to compose that into the shot, and that was going to be an important aspect of it. But I wanted to go wide because I had such incredible light that morning. I had a really, really nice sky, and I needed to find a really compelling foreground element to complement the image and really, push the eye into the shot. And so with that theme of circles, I went bounding about, walking back and forth, trying to find a really, really nice circular formation to include in the foreground. And so this was shot with an ultra wide angle lens. This is about 14 millimeters. I think I shot this at f11 probably. There wasn't any focus stacking needed. This is just very traditional shot. And then a 2-stop graduated neutral density filter to hold back the exposure in the sky, which was a bit bright as the sun was coming up.
Wow. So you are still using filters, graduated neutral density filters. I thought you were doing exposure blending.
I stopped doing exposure blending about 2 years ago.
Really? Well, let's pause on that for a minute. Why?
Because I don't like to spend that much time on my computer. Now, so here's the deal. The newer sensors, especially once I had gotten the D850, and now I work in a mirrorless system with the Z7, the dynamic range had gotten so good. You know what I mean? That a lot of times I didn't even need to bracket exposures, only in the most extreme kinds of light. And I felt like, okay, well, let me just try using a grad, because I think I could just use a grad to balance the light, because the dynamic range is so much there. Just adding another 2 stops with the grad, 99% of the time I can get all of my images now with a single capture in the field, and I don't have to worry about blending the photos later in post, which is just something that I enjoy. I've kind of taken a step back a little bit from where I was maybe 3 to 5 years ago with digital photography. And I mean, I just bought like an entire big film system, a big large format camera. So I'm going to be shooting film again, in addition to shooting my digital stuff. So I started just kind of working back into my workflow, some of the things that I used to do with film back into my digital workflow, so that I can really try to master the image in the field and just be done with it and do a little bit of development when I get back home on the back end for presentation. So that's my reasoning.
Okay. Well, that's a really good answer to the question, but of course it just basically gives us more questions. So you recently switched over to large format. You got a large format camera and you're thinking of shooting film again. Let's unpack that. What's going on there?
That's a hard one to explain, to be honest with you. So I don't know, I have always had this romanticism with shooting film. I actually missed it. I know a lot of people that shot film in the past. I think you probably feel this way. I know a lot of Kurt. I know Kurt feels this way. You know, they were like, "Oh God, never looking back," right? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, so much better. Can't really disagree with that. But I have this sort of romantic love of shooting film, and I used to shoot large format. And believe it or not, I actually enjoyed the process of setting up that camera. I like how absolutely laborious it is, how long it takes to set a shot up. It forces me to really, 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 really slow down. And, you know, I felt like I was getting to a point where I wasn't feeling very challenged any longer with the stuff that I was doing digitally. You know, I would go out and I was getting great shots every single time. And I'm not trying to, like, you know, say I'm amazing or anything, because I'm not. I make mistakes all the time, believe me. But I just wanted to try to, you know, get back into doing some film. I'm not switching over and giving up digital, obviously. I'm just working it into, you know, into my my bag of tricks. So when I go on a trip now, like, I might shoot 10 or 20 sheets of film while I shoot probably 1,500 digital images. But when I get back, I can hold those images. I can work on them. I'm working on rebuilding a darkroom in my basement, so I can do some wet darkroom work. Just trying to keep myself busy and challenged and interested in what I love doing. So,
well, I am full on board with anything that might slow you down. It'll be easier for the rest of us.
There you go.
So next up is another one of my ice cave photos. And I got a question from Sue. Where along the south shore of Lake Superior were these photos taken? So I was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the little town of Munising, which is about a half an hour east of Marquette, which is still pretty small town, but it's much bigger than Munising. And you can go out across Munising Bay. There's an island in the middle of the bay where these ice caves form. So in good years, when there's a lot of good lake ice, I can actually get out there across the lake ice to go photograph these caves. And for this, it was another ultra wide angle shot, 9mm. Actually, this is a 12mm perspective on a full frame camera. And this was a kind of a bigger cave in the opening. And I found this little small, tiny mini cave off to the side. And I had to crawl into this spot and just get myself way at the back of the cave. You know, as I said earlier, I mean, these caves aren't huge, but it's the small, intimate spaces when you open them up with a wide angle lens that really become fascinating to explore. So by getting into this small little space, and I was all hunched over, I'm just sitting there on the ground with barely enough room for me to get my eye back enough to see what's going on through the electronic viewfinder of the camera. And I was loving every minute of it. And part of what I love about these intimate spaces is that with a wide angle lens, whatever you're close to is going to look much bigger. So the icicles that are hanging from the ceiling, for example, they weren't really that big. They might have been 6 to 12 inches in size, but they loom large in this composition because they're so close to the lens. And the background where there's a person who's visiting the cave standing, he ends up looking a lot smaller. So it really plays with the sense of scale in the image, and it makes the ice caves just loom over that figure in the background. And when I saw him come in, he had this really bright orange jacket on, and I knew that that would really pop if I shifted my white balance a little bit to the cool side. So I didn't do it when I was in the field. I just shoot with automatic white balance. But when I was processing the file, I cooled down the white balance so that the ice, instead of being rendered that neutral ice color, would look a bit more blue, because I wanted to create that complementary color contrast between that bright orange and that cool blue. So I didn't shift it too far, just bringing in a little bit of a blue twang to create that color contrast. And I think that if you can find a way to do these opposite color contrasts, warm versus cool, you can make really compelling images that grab people's attention.
Agreed. Mona has a question for you, Ian, that just popped up in the Q&A. I'm not sure I understand it, so I want to read it to you, though.
Okay.
I love your ice photos. I weave beads into formations of ice with clear beads. What color background would you suggest?
Well, Bona, maybe you can expand on this and tell us exactly what you're doing. Are you, I guess you're taking photographs of this or something like that. I think a blue background would look really nice with the ice. On the other hand, if there's a fair amount of coolness in the color of the ice, having something that's a bit more warmer, like a little pop of orange or something like that, that might be nice as well.
Yeah.
So I hope that helps. And we can move on to the next slide. This is one of Joe's photos, and this is pretty cool. Tell us what's going on here.
So this was like one of those like get out of your truck and just grab the shot sort of images. This is not planned out. I was not intending on photographing this little hoodoo, these clay mounds. I was at another location in the desert for sunset, and I had finished up. It wasn't actually a very good sunset that evening. Like we had all these really thick clouds move in, it blocked the light. Anyway, as I was driving back to where my campsite was, as I came around the bend in this little dirt road, my headlights caught this formation. As soon as my headlights hit it, they were kind of light painting the rocks. These are, it's a rather small hoodoo. Maybe it's only about 5 foot tall. It's not gigantic. But my lights from my truck hit it, and I was like, "Oh wow, that is looking amazing against this." And I knew that with a long exposure at this time, this is during like civil twilight, so the deep blue hour. You don't necessarily see it with the eye because the eye tends to try to correct, or the brain tries to kind of correct for these color casts, but it will show up on your image. So I knew that I could get a really, really like deep blue in the shadows and in the sky. And then I knew with the lights in my truck, that would be the halogen, there'd be a very warm tone. So I repositioned the truck to paint the formation, and I ran over, and this is a 1 minute exposure at f11. And I got back in the truck and went back to camp and had a beer.
Oh wow! Well, that's fascinating. All of it, even the beer at the end.
Yes.
And I think the beer was well earned. I mean, I saw this photo and I assumed that you had some late light coming through when there was a thunderstorm approaching or something, and I figured that's why there was so much blue in the sky. But now that I know that this was your truck lights, yep. I'm just floored by this. I really like the composition. I like how the hoodoos sort of framed that mound in the background. Mm-hmm. But it's that color contrast, that warm, cool color contrast that yep. really makes this pop and stand out. I think it looks fantastic.
Thanks. Yeah, I love the warm contrast too. I had to really work on positioning the I set up my composition, and I had to pay careful attention that the hoodoo did not converge with that mound in the background, that there was some separation between the two of them, right? Mm-hmm. So I had to do that very quickly. And then once I had that set up, I noticed that I had my truck at the wrong angle, and it was casting my shadow and my tripod shadow well into the image as well. So then I had to run back to the truck and pull it back and reposition it again so I could get the lighting just right, then rush back over and take the image before it got too dark.
Yeah. So not only did you have to set up the composition and get the truck in the right place, but then you had to pick the exact right moment, because you couldn't just like dim the headlights or anything like that, or turn them up if you needed to. You needed to find that perfect mix of the artificial light and the ambient light. And you couldn't, if the headlights were too bright, you could back off the car, but as you move farther back, it would spread out the light and you would lose the shadows. Exactly. So you really just had to get everything set up and then just strike when that moment was perfect and the light was perfectly balanced.
Yeah, I got lucky because, like I said, as soon as I turned the road it's always winding out there. So as soon as I came around the bend, I just noticed the way the light looked on it. And I guess just through years of experience, I could just tell, like, that's perfect. It's not going to be too bright. It's not going to blow out the foreground because I'm going to have to expose for a longer period of time for the sky to get that blue in there. And I just had to reposition it a little bit so that my shadow wouldn't show up in the image.
And so this really wasn't a shot that you scouted out ahead of time. This was just sort of, you were there and all of a sudden you saw something, and, this might not have caught your attention as you were scouting. This might not have been enough to make an interesting photograph, but when you saw the light of your headlights on it just the right way, you were like, Eureka, this is going to work.
Precisely. I drove literally, I mean, this thing is only a few feet off the side of that little dirt 2-track road. I drove by this in the afternoon. I don't think I had even noticed it. It was very, the light was very uninteresting at that point, and I was sort of rushing to get out to where I was intending to be for sunset. I didn't even notice it until I saw it driving back that evening. So it was definitely a grab shot.
And this is one of the challenges of scouting for landscape photos is that, we're busy at sunrise and sunset taking photos. So most of the scouting is done in the middle of the day, but there's a limit to what you can do, because when you don't actually see that light at sunset or that light at sunrise illuminating the landforms a specific way, you're not really entirely sure what you're looking at sometimes. I will often find something that I think is going to make a really great landscape scene, and then I go back there at sunset and realize the light is just all wrong. Right. It doesn't work at all. And so, scouting is definitely something that you want to do as much as you can, and we're going to talk more about that during the program today. But there's also limitations, like you have to kind of scout when you're making photos. When you're out there during the prime light, you got to do more scouting while you're busy taking shots, because that's the only time you really see the landscape in the right light for making those compelling landscape photos.
Yeah. So the question came in real quick from Dave in regards to this image, I guess. He said, what percentage of your good shots are planned as opposed to accidentally coming on a scene like this? I don't really know. I don't know if I have a percentage wise. I don't really necessarily try to plan out shots like, oh, I'm going to be going to Utah and I'm going to take this exact shot of this subject matter. The way that I work in the field is I will plan to go to a location. I will have, like a region, for example, like Zion National Park. Now, when I go to Zion National Park, I might have it bookmarked that I want to go to A, B, C, D, and E over that week, because I think that they're really good places and they're rich in good compositions. And then I just try to match the light. I try to think like, is this going to be better on a sunny day because it's in a canyon and there's going to be reflected light? Or is this up on top of a canyon rim? Is it going to be better at sunrise or sunset, or possibly both times of the day? And then I go onto location. And I always try to get to a location early. That gives me a lot of time to, like Ian said, scout on demand, right? If you will. And then I always let the light be my guide. So I try to keep an open mind. And so if I have an idea of what I'm going to shoot, but the light isn't really right for it on that evening, it may be right for something else that's nearby. So I will just keep moving around and working the light and trying to come up with interesting compositions as I move through the shoot. And that's kind of the way that I work. So I'd say it's half planning and half just, making the right decisions when you're actually there on location in the field.
Yeah. And I think my approach is pretty similar. I used to be someone who reacted to the light. I used to not do much advanced planning. And the more I do photography, the more I try to plan and the more I scout and really try to find those compositions that I think are going to be compelling. But I think ultimately it's going to be a mix of both, because even when you find a really nice composition for landscape photography, there's one final ingredient. So there's obviously the composition itself, there's the light, but then there's also what's going on in the sky. We're shooting with wide angle lenses a lot, and the texture and the color of the clouds in the sky is as important as anything else is going on down below in the landscape. And so I employ a fairly similar approach. I tend to scout as much as I can. And like Joe, I'm looking for maybe a specific area that I want to work. So I might find an area that I like and I say, okay, this is pretty cool. I like the scenery here. And when I say an area, I'm talking about maybe an area that's a quarter mile across or something like that, like an area that I can go to and I can get across, the whole area in just a few minutes if I have to move really fast. And within that area, I start looking for those specific compositions, and I try to identify a few that will work at sunrise or sunset or twilight or whatever. And so once I've identified the compositions that I think are going to be really compelling, then I go back when the light's going to be right. And so I might have composition A, composition B, composition C, and they might all kind of look somewhat different ways. So one composition might look directly west, one might look north. And the reason I try to do that is so that I can react to what's going on in the sky. So if there's clouds in one part of the sky, but not the other part, composition A might not work, but composition B might be perfect. So I try to have a few different compositions, but ultimately, as we said earlier, when you're actually there in the moment and you see the light and you see how the weather reacts with the landscape, that's when you're making a lot of your decisions. So even though you might have something planned, it's a good idea to be able to just throw the plan out the window and react and start stitching together compositions on the fly. And I think Joe and I both do a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well said.
All right. So going on to the next image, this is just another one of my ice cave photos. And, once again, most of my work is wide angle for landscape, even for wildlife. I do a lot of wide angle work, and the wider, the better. I really love ultra wide perspectives, and it's a different type of shooting. And so for these caves, I was using pretty much exclusively my 9 and 12 millimeter focal lengths on my full frame camera. And I do that because I just love the way it opens things up, especially when you're working in a small interior. And also for something like the ice caves, there's a lot of vertical lines that are formed by the icicles hanging down. And with a wide angle lens, and when you're tilting the camera up just a little bit, those vertical lines become these diagonal lines. They're leaning in, and that creates a narrowing of perspective, which I think helps draw the viewer deeper into the composition. So I've got that going on compositionally here. I made sure to get a little bit of a starburst. So I have the sun peeking out from the edge of an icicle. And it's a good idea when you're doing a starburst to not have the sun fully out in the open, because you're going to get a lot of lens flare. So I'm always looking for a way to partially block the sun with a cloud or a tree trunk or something like that, so that it's just peeking out enough to get that starburst without getting all that flare. And you're going to want to use a small aperture like f11 or f16 on a wide angle lens to get that starburst effect. So here I've got the backlit ice, I've got the starburst, I've got that slight leaning in perspective, creating these converging vertical lines for this shot of an ice cave on Lake Superior.
Can you walk into these at this time of the year, Ian?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, the ice is in great shape. So the lake ice is great. I actually took a snowmobile across the lake ice to get into the caves. And in a few weeks, I think it's going to start warming up and the ice caves are going to start falling down, and it's going to be dangerous to be in there. But right now, the ice is perfect. So it's really fantastic. Okay,
and there's a question from David, and I'm glad that he asked this, because I was going to ask you a question that's related to the question. So David said, Ian, would creating a panorama or maybe stitching of some sort work for the ice caves rather than having to purchase? And I'm assuming it's probably pretty expensive. Your 9 millimeter, is that what lens are you talking? What is that, a zoom lens?
No, that is a Laowa. Yeah, the Venus Optics Laowa 9 millimeter.
Okay.
Yep. Fixed focal length lens. And absolutely, doing a pano stitch is a great way of opening up that interior and getting that wider angle of view. Of course, there are challenges when you're doing the pano stitch, the biggest challenge being that you've got to stitch all that stuff together. And so you have to do it just right to make sure you get a seamless stitch. But that's a great way of opening up that space within the caves. The only reason I don't do that myself, the reason why I like using the ultra wide angle lens, is that when I'm looking through the viewfinder with that lens on, I know exactly what I'm going to get. When you're doing the pano stitch, when you stitch everything together, you're going to be doing some cropping at the edges of the image frame. So it's sometimes a little bit more difficult to kind of frame things up exactly how you want, but definitely you can do the pano stitch.
Did you follow a question? Did you have to take a second mortgage out on the house to purchase that lens?
No, it's actually not that expensive.
How much is it? Just out of curiosity.
I think $700, $800.
Oh, it's okay. That's very affordable.
Yeah, really affordable.
Okay,
definitely.
Cool.
Yeah,
good.
All right, and so thank you for the questions. Just a reminder: please put the questions in the Q&A portion of the chat, and also take a look at our poll when you get a chance if you haven't done so already. And we'll move on to the next image, which is another one of Joe's. Joe, tell us what's going on here.
This is cracked mud. I love photographing. I love doing wide angle stuff, but I also love doing really intimate photographs as well. And so this is actually an interesting photograph for me. I'm always trying to find really interesting mud formations when I'm out in the desert. I like shooting them. I think that they're very graphic. This is actually was taken over one of my workshops. I had hiked my clients out to it's a pretty extensive area of mud, like maybe the size of a football field. Okay, it's very big, and everyone was doing mostly wide angle work, right? I'd gotten everyone set up to do wide angle work on the mud cracks, but I was suggesting to people, hey, once you get some nice wide angle stuff done with the mud cracks, with the mountains in the background and whatnot. We didn't have a stellar sky on this particular morning, so I said, your best shots are probably going to be right around twilight hour and just as the sun begins to come up when there's some nice warm light in the sky. And then I said, if you hike over here a little bit, there are these much smaller, more intricate mud patterns. No one wanted to take any photographs of them. Unfortunately, I went over and did a little bit of work on them, shooting straight down onto the mud formations. I really like these because they kind of remind me of like the scales of a snake, for example. They're very dried out. They're starting to curl up. And what really drew me to it, because these were everywhere, were these little circular shapes where sand had been deposited throughout the mud cracks. And I thought that circular shape really broke up the more like diagonal triangular shapes that were formed by the mud, and it created sort of a counterpoint in the image compositionally. And then this was obviously converted to black and white in post-development. It was really mostly a monochromatic scene anyway. The mud is sort of whitish, cream tone. There was no interesting light on it. So I decided to go ahead and just take it all the way into a black and white image.
Yeah. Well, I think it looks great. I mean, I just love that contrast. And this is a really good example of the statement that black defines the shapes, the shadows define the shapes.
Yep.
And, without those deep shadows, this shot just doesn't work nearly as well. So I think it's beautiful. And, I don't do a lot of intimate work, probably because I'm not very good at it. So I am very jealous of those of you who can cross over and do this. So I think it's a lovely image.
I think that you could do intimate work just as well as anyone else if you put your...
Moving on to the next ice cave shot. This is just another angle kind of showing what it looks like when you're inside the caves. And you can see the sandstone cave ceiling curving above. So you can see how these formations are actually forming in the winter. So it's mostly the ice overhanging on the edge, the outer edge of the cave. And so it's just really great getting in there and just walking behind these caves. I think it's a really interesting perspective, and there's some really fantastic colors there. You get that mix of the greens and the blues and everything else. And let's move on to this next photo by Joe. This is another intimate landscape, and this is a really nice pattern shot. I just love the alternating layers of shadow and light taking us deeper and deeper into the scene. Joe, tell us about this photo.
So this is from Zabriskie Point in Death Valley, and these badlands, you can find these badlands all over Death Valley, but this is one of the better places to shoot them. I am sort of obsessed with repetition in imagery. And so, I was using some really, really long glass to pick out different parts of the badlands where I could really just work this sort of repetition all the way through the shot. And what drew this in for me, because I also like balance in my images as well. So these are two very, very big sort of formations down here in the foreground. I wanted to make sure that I framed something of a similar shape and size in the background to sort of balance out that foreground, because otherwise it would have been a little too heavy towards the bottom of the frame. And so this is with the long lens. This is once again with my 200 to 500 millimeter, which is a great lens for doing these sort of intimate landscape images, because it allows you to really, 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 focus in on the smaller vignettes of the larger landscape. And then, so this is one that I couldn't have pre-visualized because it was light dependent, right? I can get to this location where I'm standing and I have a great view all around me with all these different layers, but the layers don't really start to come to life, in my opinion, until they have the light and the shadow. And like Ian just said, one of the things I say to my workshop clients all the time is the darkness defines the light, okay? And so that means by including these dark areas like this band in the middle and all these shadows, it's really allowing the light and the layers to come out in the shot.
Well, we've got a great question from Lenspiration, who asks, can you show us all the bad photos surrounding a good photo to help us see how you got the one photo you like? And the answer to that question is no way. You'll think less of us.
I do that on workshops all the time, though. When we do image reviews, I'll bring up stuff on my screen and say, here, guys, here's a selection of 10 images. And there's only one, in my opinion, really, really great shot inside of this. Which one do you think it is? Most of the time, people can pick it out. But it gives them an idea of the sequence that you get up to it. And so there's an old saying, right? And you probably have heard this one before. This is an old film saying. So what's the difference between a professional and an amateur photographer? The size of their trash can.
Right.
Right? Because back in the old days, you'd come back from a shoot, you'd lay all your transparencies out on your light table, and you'd keep the good ones and you toss out all the bad ones. And believe me, we both take tons of horrible photographs all the time.
Oh, absolutely. And I actually think that would be a great idea for a show. So I am going to think about that. And maybe we'll have a program in the future that we call From Bad to Good. And we'll go ahead and share with you all of our, the really bad images behind the keepers. We got a question from Dominic for you, Joe, who says, great black and white images. Did you utilize luminosity masking on them?
No, those were both of those images were both developed completely inside of Lightroom. I don't use luminosity masks. Well, here's the thing. You can kind of use luminosity masks in Lightroom. The new masking features have, in the newest version of Lightroom, is pretty good, actually. I don't go into Photoshop nearly as much as I used to in my image development. I do most of it in Lightroom, and I use almost specifically radial tools to do my dodging and burning nowadays. So.
And we have a question from Kosel. I might be pronouncing that wrong, so I apologize. Ian and Joe, how long does it take you for you guys to become photographers? And so I've been a pro for 16 years now, maybe 17. Joe, I think you've been a pro for you've been a pro for longer, because you got out of high school and you became a press photographer for a while, right?
I've been doing landscape work full time 15 years, so about a year or two less than you. But yeah, before that, I was doing press and sports photography full time. Took me a long time to break into this business, though, and this aspect of photography. Well over 10 years of building a portfolio, and then the first few years, I didn't make very much money. I saved up a lot of money before I made the switch from being a full-time sports press photographer into going into landscape, so I'd have a cushion for the first couple of years. So
yeah, I mean, I think we can interpret the question several different ways. Just how long have we been photographers? And so both of us probably have been shooting now for 25 30 years each. I
started taking photographs when I was 16 years old in high school, because I started taking black and white photo classes, and I fell in love with it immediately. So I've never not taken photographs since that class.
Another way to look at the question would be, how long does it take to become a successful professional photographer? And I think the answer to that can really vary on a number of factors. I mean, I launched myself as a pro 16, 17 years ago, and I was, always doing it full time during that whole time. I wasn't getting income from anything else. But I, lived off my credit cards for certain periods during that time. And so I don't know if I was really successful as a pro during those years that I was in the red. And I guess one final way to think of the question is, how long does it take to become a good photographer? And I think the answer to that, your entire life.
Because you should always be getting a little better. Hopefully.
So thank you for the great questions. Moving on to the next image. This is another one of my ice cave shots, and I call this the green room. This is a little cave that I was exploring. Actually, we saw this earlier, that photo I had with the guy in the orange, with the orange jacket in it. That is when I crawled deep into the background of this space. But in the early morning, the very back end of this little cave is a sheet of ice that's exposed to the light. So he was getting this really great backlighting, giving it this green glow. So this kind of looks like a frozen Hobbit hole door or something like that to me, like something out of Middle Earth meets Game of Thrones. Winter is coming and it's freezing the hobbits. But in any event, I went very wide for this shot. And yes, I did just reveal how much of a sci-fi and fantasy nerd I am by making that statement. But moving on, I framed this shot with a wide angle lens because I wanted to bring in a lot of the ice around that glowing green. And as a general philosophy, when I'm making photo compositions, I often like to have a transition from the edges to the center of the image. I like to have the edges a little bit darker and something that's in the middle of the image, something that's in the background of the composition. I tend to want to have that to be the brightest part of the image. So this transition from dark to light helps keep the viewer's eye within the composition, and helps facilitate pulling the viewer deeper in and giving them a vicarious sense of being there in the photograph. So that's what I was looking for. And I was looking for some interesting shapes to bring in as well. So in particular, I've got those strong vertical lines formed by the icicles on the left that just kind of come in and add some additional shape and visual interest to the composition.
It's an awesome shot, man. I love it. There's a couple questions in the Q&A that I'll throw out at you. First, from Mike. Oh, actually, I'll do David's first because it relates specifically to this image. Ian, are you using reflectors or any other sort of lighting in the cave to modify the light?
No, I'm using natural light, though some of the caves you have to do a little bit of exposure blending because you might be in a very dark part of the cave looking out towards a bright part. So doing a few multiple exposures and blending them together just to get more dynamic range is often very helpful. But typically, you can make a lot of these photos with just a single exposure. So a shot like this was a single exposure, for example.
Okay, then this will be a good follow-up. And I think this, I'm not sure if this is specifically for you or for both of us, so we can kind of just each go at it quickly. On average, how long do you spend post-processing a typical image? Could you briefly describe your process?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, and the answer for you probably is pretty similar. I think we're both relatively light with our processing. I might spend some time processing an image because I'm not exactly sure where I want to go with it, and I might play around with a few things. But when I actually know exactly what I want to do, typically I'm done with my processing in as little as 25 to 30 seconds, maybe at most, a few minutes to get it together. But I think both Joe and I tend to do very subtle adjustments. We're not doing any sort of extreme manipulation. And most of our adjustments tend to be small, local, targeted adjustments to the brightness or darkness of certain parts of the image, just maybe slightly emphasizing something by brightening it or de-emphasizing it by darkening and doing those sorts of local adjustments.
Yeah, I mean, you've essentially summed up my process as well. I think the longest I probably would ever spend developing an image is maybe 10 minutes. And that's if it was an extremely complex image where I had to maybe do some focus blending or exposure stacking or something like that, or some cloning. But most of the stuff, just a couple minutes probably per image. Once, like you said, once I've developed in my mind where I want the image to go in post, and you know what I mean? It may take me a little while to decide, how do I want to dodge and burn this? Or, what do I want to emphasize or de-emphasize in the image? And then once I've made those decisions, I can execute it pretty quickly.
Well, speaking of time, we've only got a few minutes left, so I want to finish up these images quickly if we can. So the next image is from Joe, and just if you could describe briefly what this is all about.
I use my flying camera. So it's a drone shot. If we harken back to the image earlier, the vertical shot from the mounds with the mountains in the background, it's the same location, but seen from an aerial perspective. In fact, if you look in the top left corner, you can see me standing on that little dome over there.
Oh, very cool. And I'll be talking about drone photography in the next live program in 2 weeks with Kurt Budliger. And so we're going to be talking a lot about aerial photography in that episode. So we're going to just very quickly move on to our final images, and then we'll wrap it up with some final Q&A. This is the last image I'm going to share from the ice caves. And one thing I love about the ice caves is when you get direct sunlight coming in, backlighting all the ice, it can be really spectacular. So I found this cave. This is one of my favorite caves. I photographed this cave in the summer. It's one of the few caves where you can kayak or boat to it and actually land. There's a small strip of shoreline, at the very back of the cave in the summer where you can land and make photos. And so it was really fun going in here and seeing it, how different it was in the winter. But the time of year that I typically photograph this cave in the late summer or fall, the sun is rising in pretty much the same place as it was when I took this photo just a few weeks ago. And so I'm getting direct light in the cave, and I was very careful choosing my exposure. I, decided not to reveal any of the texture or detail of the shadow areas because I really wanted to define that curving shape in the foreground formed by this ice that I was standing on. There was this curve of the ice, and I knew that shape would be emphasized with that first light hitting it, lighting up one side of the ice, but not lighting up what was behind it. So I let all of that fall into shadow just to more clearly reveal and emphasize the shape.
Beautiful.
Thank you. And then this final image is from Joe, and I'm extremely jealous of this. Joe, tell us about it.
So this is the only time I want to be photographing in sand dunes. I'm just joking, but it's the best time in my opinion. Is during a windstorm. So, what can I say? I braved the elements. It was a very windy day. We had wind gusts that maybe sustained 25, but gust up to 40 or 50 that afternoon. And so what I love about shooting in these conditions is the atmosphere that is created. This just doesn't normally exist when you don't have the sand blowing around like this. So it creates these really, really wonderful soft backgrounds, almost glowing backgrounds. This is shot at sunset. So I chose to hike into a part of the dunes that would be pretty far back, knowing that I was going to use a long lens to stack up all these layers. And I wanted to shoot into the sun. Okay. Because if I'm not shooting into the sun, it's not showing that glowing atmosphere. So I had to go to a section of the dunes where I could hike far back. It's actually not a very long exposure. It kind of looks like that. But this is maybe only about 1/130th of a second. The wind was just blowing the sand so hard that it's lifting off of almost every single dune in the image when I shot it. And so, like I said, long lens. Again, this is with a 70 to 200 millimeter. Right before sunset. Timing is critical for these shots because in Death Valley, you have the Panamint Mountains, which sit on the west side of the sand dunes, and the sun will go behind those mountains much, much sooner than sunset. So at least 30 minutes before sunset. So you got to be out there early, and you want to shoot this right as the sun is getting towards the ridge of the mountains, and it's at its absolute warmest and lowest in the sky.
Well, I think this photo is absolutely beautiful. And I think this proves what you and I often tell people: shoot into the light. It's very challenging to do so, but the results can be magical. They can be mysterious. And I just love the softness of this light. And there's enough texture there. The shadows are deep enough that you can see all of these layers and these patterns. Yep. But the softness of that contrast is what really makes this image, just that glow, that gauzy, warm glow over the entire image. And that is the result of shooting into the light, probably getting a little bit of lens flare, but not like the bad kind of lens flare, a good kind of lens flare that just spreads this low contrast, warm color over the entire image. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Well, let's go take a look at our poll really quick. And it looks like most of you preferred landscape, but then again, we did build this as a landscape photography webinar today, so that's not surprising. Wildlife is a distant second, then travel. Not a lot of fans of architecture, street, or portrait photography, which is fine with me. I actually love all types of photography, and I do on occasion dabble into street photography, but landscape, wildlife, and travel are definitely my favorites.
100%.
Okay, so let's see if we have any more questions. We got one here from Aaron. How do you protect your gear in a sandstorm? Joe, take it away.
It's rather difficult to do. First of all, you're not going to want to be changing lenses out in a sandstorm like that. Okay, so I tend to typically mount, bring out 2 camera bodies with the lenses mounted already, and I keep them in my bag until I'm ready to start shooting. Now, it wasn't that big of a deal when I was shooting out there. The sand was blowing around, but I shot everything basically. I'm about 5'11", so I shot everything at about 5 foot 11 inches, and most of the sand was blowing below my waist. So my gear wasn't getting tremendously bad. I made sure that I didn't sit my bag down on the dunes. I kept that on my back all the time. But the truth of the matter is, when you're shooting in some of these extreme weather conditions, there's always a chance that you're gonna, hurt your gear. Even when you're not shooting extreme conditions, like just going out into the middle of a stream, I've done it many times, slip and fall and dunk your gear and boom, it's gone. I won't let that limit me from getting a great shot. I'd rather ruin a camera in the pursuit of getting something that's absolutely extraordinary with weather or whatever than worry about, not doing it at all.
Yeah, I get this question all the time. Ian, how do you protect your gear? And my answer is, I'm a professional photographer. I do nothing to protect my gear.
Buy good insurance.
Right, exactly. The pros are the wrong people to ask about protecting their gear, definitely. We have time for one final question. The question from David: which sand dunes? Now, I think that was the Mesquite Valley dunes in Death Valley?
Correct, those are Mesquite dunes, correct.
Yeah. And okay, I think we have time for one more quick question from Brady. Besides Lightroom and Photoshop, do you use any other plugins? If so, which ones? I'm not really a plugin guy, but Joe, what about you?
I don't use them very often. Sometimes I use denoise from Nick to reduce noise, and gigapixel for upsizing certain images if I've had for very large prints. But that's it. All of my development, my creative development, 90% is done in Lightroom, 10% in Photoshop these days, I would say. So not much.
Yeah, I think the only plugin I'm using right now is Topaz Labs Sharpen AI, and
that's what I was. Yeah, Sharpen AI. Thank you.
That's a really good one.
I don't use it that often, but when I do, that's yep.
It's only when you miss.
I don't use any of the Nick plugins or any of that stuff really. So.
Yeah, I'm using Sharpening AI only in those rare instances where I misfocus on a wildlife subject or something like that. Exactly. Okay, one last question from Stacy. Do you guys use circular polarizer filters often, or ND filters? So I use a circular polarizer whenever I'm photographing streams or waterfalls, anything where there's a lot of glare on wet surfaces that I want to get rid of, and the polarizer will get rid of that glare, that reflection on the rocks and the water, and it'll help improve contrast and improve color saturation in any foliage that's surrounding the waterfall. Other than that, I'm really not using filters anymore. Joe, you are using polarizers in the same situation, and you're definitely using grads. We learned about that earlier. What about NDs?
Occasionally, only when I need an extremely long exposure for some sort of creative effect, and I can't get it, by lowering my ISO or whatever. But the CPL, circular polarizer, often, especially like you said, Ian, when anytime water or glare or reflective stuff is in the mix. And then, yes, I do use graduated neutral density filters quite a lot these days to balance light in the field.
All right. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you, Joe, for coming on. And thank you, everyone who attended this webinar. Thank you all for your great questions. We had a lot of fun. And I will be listing the next webinar very soon. So stay tuned. All right. Thanks, everyone. Great talking with you. Bye-bye.
See you guys. Thanks for coming in. It was my pleasure. Thanks, Ian.